afternoon and welcome to CEC Gurukul lecture. In continuation with the series on sociology of work, today I am going to discuss about a very important element of workplace, that is risk, hazard and disaster. Now this is something which is kind of a very important area which needs to be discussed and kind of know what all happens at a workplace. But much of the sociological or social sciences research or at work, when the work idea of work comes into mind, is around say wage or whether the workers are being paid overtime payments. Most of them are related to the economic and material conditions of workplace, because the understanding of work is any kind of a labor put in for a compensation which could be paid in the form of a wage or piece rate or salary. But what often has not been discussed is that many a time workplace can become a risk. It could kind of cause certain health issue. It could kind of also result in any kind of a disaster. And this is kind of has increased over the years that we have become technological and so much of material productions is being done. So basically we need to look about two things. One, that at certain work, which is kind of work which a person does for a certain amount of compensation and you have to do, are works which are done in certain risk area, say in a nuclear plant or in a factory which is kind of manufacturing chemicals or any kind of gas which is injurious. So a lot of safety precautions are taken there, but yet there are many a time that an accident can happen, or many a time it's kind of a very mental psychological pressure on person to work in such an place. And the second kind of risk and hazard that we need to talk about are certain kind of disasters. Now these disasters are not natural. They are not happening in the say because of flood or earthquake or any other natural cause, but these are disasters which have been happening because of certain man-made cause, and also because most of the time now that we are manufacturing nuclear bombs and many things which are very risky and dangerous. So how do we then protect the right to life? What happens when an accident happens, or what not only an accident, it's an accident would be at a small scale, a disaster could be a catastrophe would be at a larger scale. Same what happened in the Bhopal gas tragedy, and thousands and lakhs of individual women, children got affected, and it's not an effect which is only short long. The consequence of it could be seen several years after that. So therefore it is an important area which is emerging, and we need to kind of understand why a particular individual works in a certain area, and at that point we need to look into what is the role of the state. How does the state respond to such situation? How does the corporate sector work? Because much of the working with the neoliberal capitalism, much of the work of these natures are kind of involvement of transnational capital corporations, whereby many a time legal onus is on the corporate sector which are located outside. So the legal system also fails to provide compensation to the victims. So keeping these in mind, here basically today we will talk about two case studies, or rather ethnographic studies, which will help us, one, to understand how individual or workers in nuclear plant, other risk associated workplace are able to evolve strategies, are able to involve ways or modes by which they can cope with the risk and hazards. And the second is the Bhopal gas, and there we will be looking into the role of the state, how the state kind of tries to erase the memory of it from the people, how there is a quantification of the victims, how their head count of the people who died or who have kind of suffered, in order to then equate with the compensation. And even compensation becomes a problematic, because most of the time it requires certain documents for an individual to claim that compensation, and in the absence of such documentation, then it becomes kind of difficult to give that compensation. So that is a very important reading which will help us to make sense of risk, hazard and disaster. So let us now begin with looking into this case study of workers working in a nuclear plant. Now this is an article basically which is written by Francois John Bent, and he, in this article the author is describing the working conditions. What are the risks which is the result of working in a nuclear plant? The nuclear plant itself kind of gives us this idea that there is some amount of danger, there is some amount of so there's a lot of debates and discussions around in social sciences whether we need a bomb or we need a human life, and these are not negotiable debates, but then there are plants which are kind of involved in it, and obviously human life is involved in it. So we need to look into the risk which evolves in such a plant to the workers, how the workers are exposed to certain kind of chemicals, and also there's this whole idea of routinization which we can bring in from the classical understanding of work, that in an industrial setup we are going on doing the same work. So we just there's an assembly line production, Taylorism, all of this tells us that there is a route of routinization, doing the same work day in and day out. It leads to certain kind of boredom. So how do workers cope with it? They take out certain strategies to cope with this boredom and also the risk and hazards. And if this is an ethnographic work and a very contemporary work, so he will be kind of using a methodology which uses narratives, which uses the way in which workers are describing the experience of risk. So it's kind of a lot of quotations, a lot of direct work or words of their respondents are being used. The nuclear plant that the author is talking about is the one which is located in France, and it was operated by Koch-Gamma company or a transnational company. Now, what is the work that goes on in a nuclear power plant? At a nuclear power plant, we know it's kind of gives us this impression that it would be a place where there's a lot of technology, and which is could be kind of obviously this is another way in which we understand industrial work. The higher the risk we do, the higher compensation we get. So there is an element of the wage or this salary that we get which has a component of the risk, and that's why individual kind of agree to work in such workplaces, and some of them kind of are also dependent on the personality of the worker. So they wanted to do some daring work, so they are ready to take risks in life. So they would kind of prefer to work in such plants. But then it could be also the sense that it's just not your interest that can take you here. Because it's a technology based, you need to have a certain amount of expertise, you need to have a certain kind of knowledge about it in order to be a part of it. And workers believe that working there is on limits, and so working within this limit, it can be also put into this whole idea that because it's a place or a space where there is a lot of risk, there is a lot of danger, so you cannot explore, you cannot experiment anything. So there is a boundary within which you are given or you are assigned a work, and you need to be content by doing that, so as much as given to you. So you cannot kind of be innovative, and therefore it could result in some amount of boredom. So when we look into the characteristic of work, or why do we kind of consider this work in the nuclear power plant as boring, number one is the size of the plant. Obviously, it could be a large scale operation which is going, and there may be multiple units, and therefore there is a kind of a very specialized occupational division of labor. Each unit would do a very specific work, and then it would pass on to the next unit. So this could kind of also result in the workers feeling a kind of bore with their work, because they are not being involved in the entire process. And that's what we can relate it to Marx's concept of alienation, that you are only a kind of a piece in the entire process, and therefore the boredom is felt. And also when we look into it, dividing the intire workforce into smaller units, then the interpersonal relations becomes kind of scattered, and there is very little interaction between workers. Workers are just content with doing the work and then passing on to the next one. That could be another reason. The absence of social relations among workers could be the reason of boredom. This boredom also arises because of compartmentalization. Now, what is compartmentalization? It means separate compartments. And here, because we are talking about nuclear plant, we will be talking about laboratories, because there will be a lot of testing and experiments. So they will be separate. You cannot mix them, otherwise there will be some kind of a mishap which will happen. So each work is put into separate compartment or separate laboratories, and specific people with specialized knowledge are working with this. So that further reduces the interaction between the workers, and the work becomes repetitive and monotonous. The third cause of boredom is, as technology progresses, the trend is towards more automation and computerization. So we know that when information technology comes in, and we were so excited that we can now do our work very efficiently. So the computer can do much faster than a human life can do. So everything was automated, computerized. It removed the human element out of it. So the relation is now between the worker and his machine, that is a computer or any other machine. Man-to-man relation or human relations are reduced. So you cannot talk to the computer, you cannot interact with the computer, you can just work on it. So there is lack of creativity. And you kind of also look into, at after a point of time, technology starts as dominating human being. So men, or rather human being, got marginalized, you know. So the preference is now given to the computer or the machine, and credit is given to the software or to the technology which has done it, rather than the person who has actually done that work. So work becomes abstract in nature, monotonous and sedentary. So this is the three reasons why the work becomes boredom, or there is a lot of boredom in it. Now there is also a lack of interest in doing it. The individuals are working in a nuclear plant, but they are not interested in the work. They are doing it because they are getting a salary which is essential for their survival, but there is a lack of interest. And what is there? Why is there lack of interest? Because there is a lot of vigilance, you know. So you have to, the reason why there is vigilance, because a small kind of you are not vigilant and a mishap can happen. So vigilance is required because it's an area where there is a lot of risk. But when we come to see into women, workers' relations, interpersonal relations, no one wants to be kind of interacting when you are being vigilant or somebody is watching you. So you kind of tend to be concentrating in your own work, and you tend to lose your interest. Over reliability on machines. There is so much of tendency to consider machines as wholly reliable, you know. Machines can do anything and everything without any fault. If the work is not being done, the fault is on the human being, not on the machine. So you kind of, then if you're not being credited for the work that you're doing, the credit is being taken by the technology, then you start losing interest. What does this lead to then? It kind of lack of interest. There's a vicious circle. Workers don't have interest. They do the same repetitive work. They are being regulated, monitored. There's too much of vigilance. So the work becomes boring and uninteresting. So the technicians with skills are reduced as operators. Technicians are obviously people who have skills, but then you're not allowed to experiment. You're not allowed to do any kind of innovation. So the technicians would be working as operators. There are certain instructions given to you, and you work according to that. So you do not want to kind of do anything beyond that. It's almost like simply saying that a technical person is simply kind of pressing certain buttons for the work to be done. This does not enable human being to express their expertise what technical skills you have learned. You are not being able to use that. You're not being able to kind of put into practice what knowledge you learned. So there's so much of kind of, especially if you look into India, there's so much of pressure for individuals to become engineers and technical people. Now, once you get a job and you're not being allowed to put in your knowledge, it becomes a kind of a place where there's no creativity, and therefore it can be leading into a boredom. So we've realized the nature of work in a nuclear plant. It could be boring, and it is often kind of monotonous and repetitive. Now we look into this nuclear plant located in France, and where the author is saying that there are two categories of workers. The first is Kamkaji, and they are the workers who can work beyond limit. What does this mean? They are not concerned about safety. They can take a challenge. So they can do something which is beyond their capacity, which they feel that can be done without kind of bringing any harm to their body, or they can take risk, as simple as that. Those are the Kamkaji. And the rentiers are those who work within boundaries, within limits. For them, the safety is most important. So they don't want to do anything for which their life will be at a risk. So these are the two categories of workers here. Now, when we look into the difference between the Kamkaji and rentier, as we have already said, Kamkajis are the ones who can take challenge, who can take on risk, and therefore they can work beyond limits. The rentiers are the ones who work within the limits. They do not take any risk. They are very concerned about their safety. And therefore, the third is that the Kamkajis are found in the mechanical department. Now, and where you can have some amount of scope of innovation and creativity, whereas the rentiers are in the chemical departments. Now, with chemicals, you cannot kind of break the boundaries, because then it can lead to a mishap. But when we talk about both the Kamkazis and the rentiers, we see that they are kind of belong to two different domains of work, one in the mechanical compartment and the other in the chemical department. But they are both at risk. That's the similarity. That it's not that only the rentiers are at risk, and because they are working within the limits, they are not at risk. Both of them are at risk, and the words they use to express this joy after looking at danger in face. So you are obviously in front of a danger, so you don't want to show your physical, psychological that you are in threat. So you kind of again become very masculine. Now, masculinity will take us to gender, is obviously associated with power. So those who are powerful are to considered as more masculine. So you kind of speak the language of male or maleness. So after completing your work, they will explain, or the words that they use will say that the work was very difficult, it was very challenging, but they managed to do it. And the phrases like we have won the battle. Now, what does these narratives tell us? These narratives tell us that the workers are building an environment of positivity. They want to show that they have been very strong, they have been very powerful, and able to do a work which was risky, a work which was in a dangerous zone. So that is one way of coping with the danger. Now, these verbal words can be very interesting. So it kind of creates an atmosphere where the workers can then build a rapport. They can kind of interact and share the experience of doing work in a risky area, how they counteracted the, and then there are also people who kind of will create rumors, and then the debate is between whether you are a powerful man, a real man, or not. So masculinity becomes very important here, because the more masculine you are, then you will be able to work in a more risky atmosphere. Say you will be a real man to face the challenge. But not all workers are expressing their masculinity, because for them life is more important rather than expressing their masculinity or not. So then there is a kind of a gender bias, and those who are able to speak masculine language are considered to masculine, and those who are not are considered to be feminine. So there is a kind of a gender way of establishing a relations in the workplace. Now, what about women who are working? Now, we are always talking about masculinity and power. What about women workers? Because again, with technology and better improvement, women's movement, women have entered these areas as well in engineering and technological place. So, female technicians who work in the they kind of avoid putting a name to radioactivity. You know, they don't want to kind of be associated with it. Because again here they generally use it for radioactive. They don't even want to use that term. So, you know, so the females are kind of scared even to use the term because it could imply danger. And that is because they are little anxious. Potential biological effect. Obviously, again, when we look at from the effect of the chemicals on men and women's body, then we see that there is a gender dimension where women's reproductive system would be affected if in case the she is open to chemicals reaction, and that can be a long term. It could either create an infertility, or it could also that in later time if she's kind of attempting to get pregnant, it could lead into children with deformed physical body. So that is the reason why women are more concerned about the biological effect than the psychological effect. So there are different attitude of women towards radioactivity. One is the biological effect, and obviously the exposure to radioactivity will have an effect on the reproductive functioning of the body. And then there is also the concern about the skin. Now, the skin will be affected if there is a kind of exposure to the radioactivity. And again, there is a gender dimension. Women do not want to kind of bring about any harm to the body, because it's also about beauty and the way the body is perceived by the society. So, there are a lot of health issues and the concern about exposing the body to the radioactivity among the women. And there are two processes basically where the author is talking about irradiation and contamination. Irradiation is caused by rays emitted by a nuclear substance, and it is seen in a positive light, whereas contamination, if you look into the word contamination, it's negative. That is, it contaminates something. When we say it is contaminated, means it is spoiled or it has been kind of decayed. So, it's negative. Irradiation is kind of associated with strength, contamination with decay. This is how the workers associate themselves to kind of cope up with the risk. Workers are working in nuclear sector. Being contaminated is more dangerous than eradication. Contamination means the body is going to decay. It's dangerous. And it could be also because if you have been contaminated, then you cannot even have kind of a marriage partner, because it will kind of have a consequences after marriage. So, eradication and contamination are two processes which helps us to understand the way in which, but when we look into the strategy, there are two strategies. Either they confront the radioactive directly, or they endeavor to make themselves master of it by avoiding. You either confront it or you just avoid kind of thinking about it. So, that is the magic of the nuclear plant, that despite being an area of risk, despite being a place where there is a lot of risk to the work, workers are working, both the Kamkazis and the rentiers are working in this, but they are kind of a system that they have evolved which helps them to continue working in that. So, he will kind of exceed the order, work more, or he may neglect and be there. So, that is why the author is calling it as a magic of the nuclear power plant. But what is very important is that now sociology of work is kind of evolving and working on this area. So, we now have a sub branch which is called sociology of risk, which talks about how workers are not only concerned about the material benefit, but also about risk, about dangers, and how they themselves are evolving a method to cope with the risk, and despite vigilance, despite regulations. So, that is the interesting way in which everyday procedures becomes defensive strategy to combat anxiety. With this, I come to an end of this lecture. Thank you.